Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Tech Tuesday. Glad everybody could join us here tonight. And the subject of my talk tonight is vitamin D. And that came about because I was able to attend a very interesting medical webinar the other night. We have these things that come up for CPD points or continual professional training. And it was a doctor from Cape Town who was talking about vitamin D. Now, anytime any medical person talks about vitamins, my ears pop up and I want to know a little bit more. And his talk was fascinating. It was very technical, I call it higher grade, even for me, because I did battle a little bit to keep up with all the funny tests and things that they were talking about. But I found it very, very informative. And it occurred to me that vitamin D is an extremely important vitamin that a lot of us are missing. So I did a little bit of extra research and delved into what our SAB members put out and put together this little summary tonight. I don't know if I'll get it all done tonight, but if not, well, we can carry on again next week. It's no big deal. But let's start over here. And my title is Vitamin D. Is it a miracle supplement or not? There are some interesting things that I picked up out of it as well. Now, the first part of this talk I'm taking from an article written by Dr. David Shepherd, who is one of our SAB members. And his question is it a universal vitamin? Over the last decades, there have been over 400 articles reporting on research projects devoted exclusively to vitamin D. Why such a large number of research projects on this particular vitamin? It would appear from the list of reports that vitamin D is being shown to be required for many other functions in the human body than was traditionally known. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but technically, vitamin D isn't a vitamin. And I'll explain about that just now. But why do we need vitamin D, and what are the consequences of its deficiency? Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin that is found in comparatively few foods. It can be produced within your body when ultraviolet rays from the sun strike the skin and stimulate the production of vitamin D. But there are certain, in the classics, they say terms and conditions. Well, terms and conditions apply very much for this to happen as well. And you've got to have a certain amount of skin exposed the right time of the day for the right amount of time for this vitamin D production to actually happen. And then quite often what happens is, because you're out in the sun, you perspire. So first thing people do is they rush off and they go and shower. And there goes all your vitamin D. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The vitamin D obtained from sun exposure, food, and supplements is biologically inert. In other words, it doesn't do anything, it just sits there. And it has to go through two activations in the body before it can be used. The first occurs in the liver, and the second occurs primarily in the kidney and forms the physiologically active 1,2,5 dihydroxy vitamin D. Fancy term, or that's the big fancy term. The simpler term for us is known as calcitriol. Vitamin D has various functions, including the absorption of calcium in the gut, which is why they mix vitamin D with our calcium and magnesium. And this helps your bone have normal mineralization. And it works to prevent hypocalcemic tetany, which is a condition of continued spasm of a muscle resulting from chronically low blood calcium. So your muscle goes into this tense spasm and it doesn't quit. It's like having an electric shock where you're attached to this electric outlet and you're just shaking the whole time and it doesn't quit. And that's what that tetany is. Basically, that is what tetanus does. Tetanus is otherwise known as lockjaw. Well, lack of vitamin D does a similar thing. And it is also needed for bone growth and bone remodeling by osteoblasts, which are cells which build bone, and osteoclasts are the cells which break down bone. Now, if you've ever watched a serious renovation project happen, where these guys come along and they take a building and they flatten it, whether they blow it up with dynamite, whether they just knock it down with hammer and chisel or heavy machinery, you've got this whole building that just disintegrates into rubble. Technically, if you fall and you break a bone, this is what the osteoclasts do. They're the guys that come in and they break down that bone, and they've got to get rid of that stuff. So the building's been flattened. Now you've got to get rid of all that rubble before you can start to create a new building. And the osteoblasts are the cells which create your bone. Because with our bodies are made up of cells. Even your bones, which we think are hard, are still made up of cells. Different types of cells, but cells nonetheless. Now, as I often tell people, if you had to cut through a healthy piece of bone, it should look like the inside of a crunchy chocolate. We won't talk about how bad chocolate is for you, but if you ever want to see what bone looks like, get a crunchy chocolate, break it open, and have a look at that golden honeycomb on the inside. That is what healthy bone should look like. Now, your osteoporotic bone, or your bad bone, looks like the inside of an Aero chocolate. Again, you don't have to eat the chocolate, but go and break it open and have a look and see what it looks like. And that'll give you a pretty good idea what your bones look like or should look like. Without enough vitamin D, the bones can become thin, brittle, or misshapen. Have you ever heard of brittle bone disease? Having enough vitamin D prevents rickets in children and osteomalacia, or the softening of bones, in adults. And the softening is basically your bones don't break, they bend. I see in my medical practice, sadly, I wouldn't say very often, but a good few cases a year come through an orthopedic surgeon, who then often refers them to me because he's got to do surgery. And you see these children quite often, unfortunately, quite heavy set, and their legs just bow out. And that is, we know it as Blount's disease, otherwise known as rickets. But basically, the bones are too soft to hold up the weight of the body, and they just bend out. So these kids have very baggy knees. Now, together with calcium, vitamin D helps protect older adults from osteoporosis, where bones are very brittle and can easily fracture. Now, people often make the mistake of thinking that only women can get osteoporosis. This is, in fact, very wrong, because men can get osteoporosis as well. And it is more prominent in ladies, simply because in most cases, when they have a baby, that baby is a sucker, and it takes all your calcium out of your bones because it needs calcium from somewhere. If it's not getting it from the mom's diet, it's getting it from the mom's bank account in the form of her skeleton, because it also needs its skeleton to grow. So that little baby inside a mom is a little sucker. So it needs to have the correct food. So it's so important for a new mom to have sufficient calcium in her system to be able to feed that little baby. Now, it also enhances the intestinal absorption of iron, magnesium, phosphate, and zinc. This is obviously your minerals. Vitamin D has other roles in the body, including regulation of cell growth, neuromuscular and immune function, as well as the reduction of inflammation. Can we see why this is looking more like a universal, very important vitamin, which in a lot of cases we're not getting enough of? The main theme that comes out of these reviews is that there is a general vitamin D deficiency, which is a worldwide problem with many serious health consequences. Vitamin D deficiency is now recognized as pandemic and may be caused by the lack of sun exposure among humans, which in turn can lead to low levels of vitamin D in the body. And from what I can gather, one of the first places they picked up this low vitamin D story was in Australia, which is commonly known as the sun capital of the world. Australia, like Africa, has an awful lot of sun, but they also have an awful lot of skin cancer. And because people are generally paranoid about developing skin cancer from being out in the sun, they cover up. So they're either out wearing long sleeves or full wetsuits if they're out surfing, or the parts of their skin that is exposed, they cover it with thick sunscreen. They're wearing hats, you're wearing gloves. We've got a car guard in one of our local shopping centers over here, and it can be the absolute hottest day out. And this gentleman walks around and he's got a big floppy hat on, he's got sunglasses on, he's got gloves on, and he's got long sleeves, long pants. There's virtually nothing of his body that is exposed to the sun. Now, I can only assume that he has a medical condition which is causing this, but I've never actually had a chance to speak to him to find out. But that is part of the problem why people don't get enough vitamin D, because they're out in the sun, but they don't want to get skin cancer. But because they're covering up and protecting themselves from harsh sun rays, they're losing out on their vitamin D. The other places that you'll find a lot of low vitamin D levels is in places like the Muslim countries, where especially the ladies are completely covered up. In some cases, you can just see the eyes. In other cases, they've even got a mosquito netting in front of the eyes. So there's absolutely nothing. Sometimes you can see the fingers, but there's absolutely no skin exposed to the sun. And they also have very low vitamin D levels. Further, very few foods naturally contain vitamin D, and foods that are fortified with vitamin D are often inadequate to satisfy either a child's or an adult's vitamin D requirement. And of course, if these fortified foods are not consumed, then the benefits of the fortification are not obtained. Vitamin D deficiency causes rickets in children and can worsen and lead to osteopenia, which is a weakening of the bones. And when you have an X-ray and they have a description of osteopenia, you look at the X-ray, you can see that the bones are a lot thinner than normal. And then you have osteoporosis and fractures in adults. So we often talk about these little old ladies. There are no little old ladies on this talk, but these little old ladies that I see them in casualty not quite often, or once they've been admitted, and they say, oh, yeah, I had this terrible fall. I was out in the garden and I stumbled, and it sounded like I'd stood on a stick, and I stumbled and I fell and I broke my hip. And what the actual sequence is that what sounded like standing on a stick was their bone breaking. They then obviously stumbled, and by the time they fell, the bone was already broken. And they have a fracture neck of femur, which is not a good thing. Vitamin D deficiency has been associated with increased risk of common cancers, autoimmune diseases, hypertension or high blood pressure, as well as infectious diseases. If the case of not having enough exposure to the sun, at least 800 to 1,000 international units of vitamin D3 per day may be needed to achieve adequate levels of vitamin D to confer the beneficial health effects in children and adults. Vitamin D2 may be equally effective for maintaining circulating concentrations of 25-hydroxy vitamin D when given in physiological concentrations. Please don't worry about all these big fancy terms. Just know that there are two main sources of vitamin D, vitamin D3 and vitamin D2, which are the main ones that we need to be looking at. it is clear that if its deficiency can produce many potential health problems, then its correct level in the body can probably overcome certain serious health problems. Logic. From the above, it is also clear that there are very good reasons to study vitamin D in such detail as it is becoming the universal vitamin, having effects on many different systems in the body. And one of the things that they picked up during the recent pandemic was that those who suffered the most and unfortunately died quite often were those whose vitamin D levels were very low. And the common thing that came out was that if you were overweight or obese, quite often obese, had diabetes and low vitamin D levels, your outcome was not very good. If you were obese or overweight and had diabetes, but your vitamin D levels were sufficient, they didn't have the same problems. So it's become a very important vitamin nurse. So how do we make sure that we get the required recommended levels of vitamin D? There are several food sources, as described above, such as cod liver oil and milk. I'm not too sure about you, but how much cod liver oil have you had today? Milk, I've had a bit. Not a lot, but I've had a bit. And cod liver oil, I can't say I've actually had any. Obviously, other foods are available, especially in the USA, that are fortified with vitamin D. So make sure you get your regular dose of vitamin D, because more and more research is showing that it is needed for so many of our body functions and to keep us in good health. So the often silent manifestation in children are found to have bowing legs, kyphosis, which is a bending of the spine where it leans forward, and soft bones, which is known as rickets. And adults can experience chronic muscle aches and periosteal bone pain, best detected with firm pressure on the sternum or tibia. So you press and you check and see if there's a lot of pain, and then you know. So some of the signs of vitamin D deficiency in adults isn't always obvious, but things like mood changes, where people are just, they're depressed in a lot of cases. There's bone loss, which you'll only really pick up with bone density tests or bone density x-rays. Muscle cramps or weakness in the muscle. And this will happen not only after you've gone for a run, but you'll have these unexplained massive cramps in the legs. This makes me think, because I need to actually share this with somebody who's been complaining about this just recently. And then they'll also have bone and joint pain, especially in your lower back. So if you know somebody who's constantly complaining about lower back pain, they haven't fallen, they haven't been in an accident, they haven't lifted anything heavy, and there's no other real reason why they should have back pain, let them check their vitamin D levels. And also chronic fatigue is the other thing. And vitamin D is for more than just bone health. Understanding vitamin D's communication via the receptors throughout the body has opened up insight into new roles of this vitamin well beyond bone health that includes immune health and athletic performance. The first thing is cardiovascular system function. Given vitamin D's integral role in maintaining tissue levels of calcium needed for muscle contraction, and yes, your heart is a muscle, it follows that muscle function, particularly cardiac function, is dependent upon adequate status for this vitamin. Also, research shows that sufficient vitamin D levels are critical for cardiorespiratory fitness. So if you know somebody who's an athlete and they just can't quite get the level that they're looking for, and most of the time they're practicing their sport indoors, they probably are deficient in vitamin D. For our outside athletes, your road runners, your rugby players, soccer players, tennis players, those sort of people, generally they're getting enough vitamin D, because often in those cases, they're wearing shorts, so they've got more skin exposure and they're spending more time out in the sun. But check and see what the story is over there. Now, to measure cardiovascular fitness, maximal oxygen consumption during exercise is measured, and this is called VO2 max. In almost 2,000 individuals aged between 20 to 49 years of age, it was determined that there was a significant positive association between serum vitamin D levels and VO2 max, the number that describes your cardiorespiratory fitness, suggesting improved cardiovascular function with better vitamin D status. The immune system function. Exciting research suggests vitamin D serves as a powerful support for your immune system. Vitamin D stimulates the innate immunity, which is basically your first-line defense mechanism, where your body develops a non-specific response to something that is foreign to the body. So you have two different types of immune systems, basically, one of which you're born with and one of which develops. The one that you're born with, you pick up through genetics. So pretty much whatever your mother or your parents were exposed to, you will have some sort of immunity to that. And then as you go along, children often get sick because they've always got these snotty noses. And that's basically the immune system learning and developing. So they get sick quickly and easily, but they also get better quickly and easily. And that is the important thing. So if your immune system is operating optimally, according to Dr. Don Lawson, if you pick up a flu virus, for instance, your immune system will immediately detect that there's a virus. It will check it out. It will dissect it. It will work out what its DNA structure is, and it will develop an antidote to that virus that is valid for 30 years. And it's going to do that in roughly about 30 minutes. That is how developed and potent our human body is. We just have to give it the correct tools to be able to do that. One of the ways vitamin D may do this is by indirectly creating antimicrobials that can destroy the bacteria, because that is essentially what your immune system does. Also, this vitamin may modify your immune responses through our gut. Remember, your gut is a very important part of your immune system. And as such, it needs to be taken care of very, very carefully. This is the problem with certain medications, is that it can destroy the good bacteria in your gut. And that's why it's so important to boost your good bacteria so they can overcome the bad bacteria. Muscle function and athletic performance. Vitamin D keeps the thermostat for calcium levels operating 24/7. And new research shows this may play a significant role in optimizing muscle function and contraction and ultimately athletic performance. So if you know of an athlete who's regularly complaining about getting cramps, maybe their vitamin D levels are a bit low. Research from sports science laboratories shows that supplemental vitamin D may improve different measures of performance and help combat potential vitamin D deficiency in athletes that train and perform indoors, such as martial arts participants, gymnasts, etc. Even your we call them gym buddies, who spend a lot of time indoors in a gym. They're athletes, they're lifting weights, they're pushing their cardiovascular, but they don't go outside. They do it all inside. Normal cell changes and cell growth are affected. Vitamin D receptors have been discovered in many sites throughout the body, such as in the intestines, lungs, kidneys, pancreas, and brain. Researchers note that body cells need proper vitamin D levels for normal growth and function of specific cells. This role helps to explain emerging evidence that insufficient vitamin D status is linked to abnormal cell growth and some cancers. Running out of time over there. So, what are some of the vitamin D solutions? Supplementation with vitamin D helps to ensure that we obtain adequate levels of this vitamin, since obtaining enough from diet alone, along with our tendency for indoor living and use of sunscreens, easily exacerbate the problem. When it's 35 degrees outside and about 140% humidity, you generally don't want to spend too much time outside. But sitting inside in air-conditioned luxury means that your vitamin D levels are going down. And obviously, as a result of that, you get sick more easily. And I must say that when I had the dreaded C, I was feeling really, it's an exhaustion I don't ever want to experience again. But I was tired of lying in bed. I also really didn't have the energy to get up and move, but I forced myself to do just that. And I went and sat. I'm fortunate in that I've got a nice front veranda, overlooks the sea. And I went and sat outside in the sun for about half an hour. And it was almost like flicking a switch. Suddenly, I wasn't feeling so down and depressed and sorry for myself. And my energy levels came back and I felt good. I was still tired, but I felt energized and I was able to carry on. And I always find it so sad when I see people in hospital. They're sick, they're depressed, they're not happy campers, and they're stuck inside. And hospitals, unfortunately, are not really designed to expose people to sunlight. And it's not a good thing. Just my opinion. So before I go on to the next section over here, because it's going to be done by Dr. Ariana Karugi, I think I'm going to stop here before I run out of time. Then we'll carry on with this next week. I'm going to stop my share. And does anybody have any questions or comments before I stop recording?